Do you ever feel like Claude gets dumber with every message that you write? You're not alone. Let me tell you what's happening here.
So I had Claude come up with this very beautiful presentation for you, beautiful in quotes. It's about context rot. So this is why it gets dumber and what you can do about it. You probably know this. You go in, you get good answers, you get instruction following, you get that it remembers perfectly what you've said. And then 45 minutes in, a very long session, it started contradicting. It just ignores the Claude.md, which is a special file for Claude Code specifically, or agents.md, where it has instructions that it should always follow. It just repeats or just does stupid things. I think, it's most obvious, I think, with Claude Code. So if you write code, but you also notice it in Claude chats. And what's happening is that it's not forgetting anything, but it's kind of deprioritizing, right? So as the conversation grows, the attention degrades across the context window. Earlier instructions get drawn out by more recent instructions, and it's basically a quality problem. And again, real examples here are ClaudeMD being ignored, just doing things it's already done, and then noticing, okay, I already did that, and yeah, just, overall being dumb, as I said. And why this is bad is that, a lot of people that don't know any better, they start blaming themselves. They say, okay, I must have done it wrong, or they just lose trust in the tool itself. And then, it limits what kind of tasks you can delegate. There's a ceiling to the complexity. And yeah, so coding agents stop, following coding instructions, architecture rules. If you're in a long running refactor, of course you may run into issues here. And, for business users, it's, just drifts from your voice, forgets strategy, forgets preferences and all that. And why has it not been solved? Essentially, what we've seen is bigger context windows, but essentially, that context size and the quality of the retrieval, they are independent. There's something that's called lost in the middle, which is essentially that the model is good at remembering what's in the beginning, and it remembers what it did last. Like the most important thing you can remember through reinforced instructions is that you just repeat yourself, but I'm going into details in a bit. And essentially, it just struggles with what's in the middle, because what it knows first, the system prompt, has a lot of weight, and then what you said last has a lot of weight, right? So essentially, the same model, no matter if you use Sonnet 200K context window or 1 million context window, it's basically the same retrieval capacity. And it's essentially an architectural problem of LLMs, which, is hard to solve, right? Like, I think people are trying to solve it, and here's what has been tried so far. So there's context compaction, which is essentially what Claude is doing in a long conversation. You've probably seen this before, and also Claude Code is doing. But it's essentially a summary, and that means loss, right? So it's a lossy compression of the conversation. And if it's not spot on with what it compresses and what it keeps and what gets lost during the compression, you will have quality loss, which I think is much more noticeable in Claude Code than it is in Codex. Codex is actually doing a pretty good job at this, but Claude Code and Claude Chat, Claude desktop app are essentially the same. And then we have RAG, which is essentially just pulling context on demand instead of carrying it throughout. We have structured context, ClaudeMD, system prompts, skills, front load what's important. So system prompt is front loading what's important. But for example, if you have a lot of skills, they also can lead to context rot just because skills are auto discoverable. So essentially there is some tokens that get injected just so that the LLM knows when to call a specific skill. That's the same with commands. It used to not be like this, but at some point, Anthropic just updated it, and then all of a sudden our 100 commands that we had, they all injected tokens into the context because they just turned them into skills, which essentially broke the performance without us even knowing until we figured out what was happening. And what else can you do? Multi-agents, right? So you can make smaller scoped agents that have fresh context windows. So a lot of times you will see this in Claude Code. There's the Explore agent, which goes out and searches a lot of files, and then it just gives back
yeah, it just gives back a summary of what it found, and it will run within its own context window, which means you're not gonna dilute or pollute rather the main context window from the main agent. And this has, again, pros and cons, right? So right now, Claude Code is relying a lot on those agents to explore things, but often they will get things wrong, especially because they're using a cheaper model. So you're using like Haiku or Sonnet, which means, yeah, they're dumber, you know, and essentially it's, as a mental model, like the map is not the territory. So essentially you're getting a map handed back by the agent of like, this is what I'm seeing, and the main agent has to evaluate that. And if that is inaccurate, you'll lose a lot of detail, right? So that's kind of how you can think about it. And so it is good for certain things and not so good for others. But generally, when I have exploration tasks where I know there needs to be, 10,000 records have to be searched, and I only want to give back 2 or 3, then I would recommend a multi-agent system. And yeah, there's also new architectures, that are being explored, but they're very far in the future. So that's definitely a space to keep an eye on. All right. And what's interesting and what's a paradox, essentially the things that are supposed to help AI remember actually accelerate that context rot. So for example, if you have a large Claude MD or Agent MD file, it actually makes the performance worse because you're already giving it way too much information from the get-go, right? That's why people recommend to make very small files and really only have a couple of rules in there, the most important ones. And I think it's best to let the agent decide as much as possible by itself if you can trust it to do a good job, right? So that's kind of a rule of thumb, and it's not good to over engineer these kind of files, because yeah, you're eating attention budget. And then everything that you persist, is one less token for the actual work. So also if you have local files that you let it read, you might end up burning through a lot of the attention already just doing that. So you're starting every conversation already fucked, essentially. All right. So what helps, because I don't want to just be German and complain, you can keep a collection of key prompts. So there are these prompt CMSs essentially. And whenever you notice the LLM becoming dumb, and saying stupid things, you paste those prompts back in to reinforce them, right? So essentially you're reminding it, and because it's been the last command, or it's added to the stack again of commands or prompts, it will be reminded to keep doing that. And then, it pushes what's said here, it pushes the instructions into the high attention zone of the context. Again, that's like at the end, right? And my internal tool, saying MCP, is called ContextOS, does this automatically. Essentially, I have created an MCP with a very slim token, footprint. And I always just have a system there that says, do this specific task. So it's kind of like a command, but within the command, I say at the end, walk through these 5 steps. Does the process, right? So it does 5 things. And then I say it as step 6. Now refetch this thing and add it again. Whatever the fuck that was. And then, it re-injects that via MCP, which of course reminds it to do that, but at the same time, it's also takes context away, right? So it's not a perfect solution, but so essentially you're micromanaging it, and you're basically like an intern, and every 5 minutes it's doing work, and every 5 minutes you say, remember to do this, remember to do that, and do it this way, because otherwise it forgets, right? So that's how you can think about it. But essentially this is a skill, right? Which is like why people are complaining that people say we're vibe coders or whatever. I think to get a great result of the tools, you actually need to manage the model's attention like a resource. That will give you the best results. And I think ultimately, you want to, for example, in plan mode, also use files more, essentially to make your own summary, because you know what's important in the conversation and you don't want to rely on the LLM to do a summary for you of the conversation. But you know, this is, for example, one thing that Claude Code does is if you go plan mode, it writes a file, and then it's always, I would recommend, because you don't have to, but I would recommend to always say clear the context and then start fresh. And so what it will do, it will start a fresh session and it will basically read the plan file, and the plan file includes all the necessary information for it to read the files that it needs to read in order to like load up the context again, but you lose all the back and forth of like you writing the plan together with Claude Code or whatever. And again, here, like Codex handles this better than Claude Code. And as a principle, you know, separate you thinking things through with the LLM from actual work of doing it, which means if you clear up the clutter, it will do a better job at executing. Yeah, so this is what I said, right? Like keep a tracking file. This is your source of truth. When the context rots, hand the file back to a fresh session, and then it will be up to speed again. So that you can even make a command for this. I think we have /onboard or something, and then you say here, like read this work in progress file, and then it will read that file and will understand what it needs to do. And it's gonna be way faster. You know, it's gonna be way faster to do this than it will be to use an LLM or use Claude Code while it's at its limits, and then it is fucking dumb, and you try to keep telling it the same thing and it still does it wrong. So you're gonna lose so much time doing that. So it's just better to start over. So yeah, in terms of principal, conversations are disposable. The artifacts, you know, should persist. And then of course you can clean up once you're done. And another lesson here, you know, just don't try to do everything in one conversation. One conversation should do one thing, and you should think about before you start the session, you know, do I need to plan like something? Is it just a very quick bug fix? It's just a back and forth, or do I need a complete plan and I need to spend the time figure out what to do? You know, or should I set up the local tracking file and all that? And so essentially that is a skill again, right, that you should cultivate and you should think about actively. And essentially, you know, that's how you get the most out of it, is to just treat it as a tool and don't, you know, turn your brain off completely when you start using a tool, because I wouldn't, you know, close my eyes and use a drill and expect a good result, right? So I think this is kind of common sense. But yeah, so again, to summarize, context rot is why I feels like an intern with amnesia. And if any of this stuff sounds interesting to you, hopefully, you know, my rant here and my beautiful presentation sponsored by Claude Code. Yeah, just subscribe and I'll see you in the next video. All right, cheers.